Hi, everyone. This is Karen White of Divine Time Astrology, and today we have a special treat. Neeshee Pandit came back on my channel so that he can teach us about eclipses. It's a subject that I haven't delved in very deeply myself, and you'll find out why as we go along. But Neeshee is going to tell us why he is passionate about them. And we have an eclipse coming up. I believe it is a partial solar eclipse on the 6th of January. Okay, so thank you, Neeshee, for coming back to school us on eclipses.
Well, thanks for having me, Karen. This will be an interesting discussion.
So what got you into it? How did you first fall in love with that aspect of astrology?
Well, I think what got me into eclipses is the same thing that got me into any aspect of astrology, which is experience. You know, what is so powerful about astrology is that you can experience something in your life and then you can see how there was a planetary correspondence with that. You know, and as we live life, we become more and more attuned to those kinds of processes. And it's like, wow, we're living this. You know, we can feel the planets. We can feel how the cosmos is shaping our life. Well, I found eclipses to be very powerful events just in my life, you know, like very dramatic events in my life. And the last eclipse, what was it? The total solar eclipse of August across the United States, that was a major eclipse. And I think that is what really shifted my perspective on eclipses. Whereas before I didn't consider them that much, or I wasn't really in tune with them. That eclipse was on my ascendant. So I really, you know, got a full taste of it. And it was just amazing, you know, to me, what the power of these eclipses. And, it was a very difficult time for me, but a lot came out of it, you know, that was positive too. So, and I just started to see, like, in other people, you know, my clients and just people in general, just the world, I just looked at these eclipses and the patterns of them and saw that they really exert a powerful influence that is not just that moment, but spans a period of time, you know?
Well, yeah, and that's exactly some of the problems I have with eclipses. And that is, you know, with the background of horary and so many things in Vedic astrology where aspects need to be exact, right? The bhava to the house cusp in order for you to really feel the full effects or for it to trigger off an event. You know, when I learned about eclipses as well, it could affect you for up to 6 months.
That's right.
But then there's another eclipse, right? And I'm like, well, okay. It seems really nebulous, almost like it is for Pluto and Neptune and Uranus when it's going over certain parts in your. It's such a long transit, and it has such a gradual transformational effect that it's kind of hard to put your finger on. And then this last eclipse in August, it was exactly right to the same degree as Donald Trump's Atmakaraka Mars in the ascendant.
That's right.
And so I was waiting to see, okay, something's got to happen, right? I have to say, though, I don't follow everything that's going on in politics, so I might have missed something.
And it's hard for us to really even know what's going on in politics, right?
There's probably a lot that
we're given spins. It's always a point of view. We don't actually know what happened for him, really. They're so subjective.
I think a lot of people were expecting him to drop dead or something.
Yeah, right.
And then the same thing, my husband's moon is also exactly at 29 degrees Leo. And I was expecting something like, because, you know, it's the natural ruler of mother and all that. Nothing happened. So I'm like, okay, maybe I'm not looking at this with the right eyes. So your turn.
Yeah. I think
the right eyes are.
I think you're bringing up a lot of good points, Karen. And the key to dealing with planets that are invisible, you know, like Rahu and Ketu and the outer planets. You know, the outer planets are not invisible in the way that Rahu and Ketu are. They're just farther away. But Rahu and Ketu actually don't exist in any embodied form, right? They're just points.
But
so they're more subtle than any of the other planets. And for that reason, they're harder to grasp in concrete terms. their effect is deeply subjective, you know, and very difficult to see in any objective terms at all, except much after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like you can see like, oh yeah, Rahu brought this up for somebody, you know, or gave them this concrete thing. But before that, it was primarily a subjective psychological event for the person, you know, that had no outer ramification until much later. So that's part of the issue in dealing with amorphous planets, you know, and the moon is like this. I mean, look at nakshatras. They're so difficult, at least in my opinion, so difficult to use and understand because their quality is not fixed like a Rashi. It's not definable like solar things are definable. It's amorphous, it's fluid, it's shifting, it's dreaming, you know? And so what do amorphous, you know, and subtle things require of us? They require us to enter into a different dimension of consciousness to understand them, you know? And what they render is also much more interpretive, you could say, you know, or open to interpretation than it is, this is what's going to happen to you.
So are you saying that it's almost entirely subjective?
I'm not saying that it's entirely subjective. I'm saying that it registers in a subjective level. In other words, what happens for one person is going to be different than another person, you know? Not all Leo Lagnas, you know, experience the same thing that I did on that eclipse. But on an archetypal level, there's something we experience of the eclipse pattern that is universal. And that's what we need to identify is like, what is the pattern of these eclipses? And the way to understand that is we have to get to a more archetypal level, you know, in which we're reaching a universal that transcends particulars, that transcends like objective events and time spans. It's like we're now getting to a level where we're seeing a context. And from there, all kinds of things can manifest. But if we can grasp like a more fundamental strata, that's really what the significance of eclipses are. Like if I'm talking to clients, I'm not telling them, oh man, look, on this eclipse, you're probably this is going to happen to you, and this won't, and on 3 months in, this will happen. I'm not making predictions like that. I'm just saying, look, this is a significant eclipse for you, you know, and then you should read what I write about that eclipse and just see what that crystallizes for you. You know, I don't have anything in particular to, you know, give on an objective level to somebody about that. I want people to more like contemplate, you know, what that eclipse is about, you know, because that'll mean something to them. It's hard for me to do like a Gemini technique on them, you know, and say like, this is what right?
So it's certainly not concrete.
No.
Now, one of the other problems that I've had with the eclipses, doing the astrology for eclipses, is that it seems to always be a negative thing.
Right.
And then 6 months later, you get another negative thing, or it could be reversed. I've heard that too. Like something good, things are going good, there's an eclipse, that all gets reversed. Things are going bad, there's an eclipse, that all gets reversed. And I'm like, that's just kind of crazy to me. I mean, that just seems very, is that true?
Okay, two things.
That's how it works?
There's two things, you know, that the real answer to that question is in my article, The Yoga of Eclipses, which was too extensive for me to attempt to elaborate here, but I'll say something about that issue, which has bothered me for a long time. But before I say that, I wanted to say one more thing, which relates to your last point. And the reason eclipses are significant is the same reason that Rahu and Ketu are significant in the birth chart. And what eclipses are doing is activating Rahu and Ketu in the birth chart. Okay, that's why they're so important.
Somewhere. Okay, that makes sense to me.
Now that makes sense, right? I want to make sure I got that point across.
Okay.
That's the whole meaning of an eclipse. Is like it's a reckoning with your Rahu and Ketu at another level. And it's not true of everybody. You know, it depends if the eclipse the eclipse is happening, you know, on one of your self factors or not. That's when you're really going to experience that, like, this is when you're going to be experiencing Rahu Ketu stuff coming up for you.
Okay, so let me ask you another question about that. Right now, so for this upcoming partial solar eclipse on the 6th,
right,
there is a tremendous lineup in Capricorn.
That's right. Most planets are in Capricorn.
And that's where Ketu is. All this is in my ascendant.
That's right.
Now, it's aspecting my natal Rahu in Scorpio by a sextile, right? It's 3 and 11. Do I even try to see if the transiting Rahu Ketu eclipse is in relationship to my natal Rahu, or does it not matter at all?
It doesn't matter really.
Okay.
My point of view. It doesn't matter really, because the point is that Rahu and your one of your self factors is being eclipsed.
Okay.
That's what matters, right? And that means that you're experiencing Rahu and Ketu in the present. How you experience Rahu and Ketu in the present is going to be determined by how Rahu and Ketu are in your natal chart, right? It's like how we talk about outer planet transits. It's like outer planet transits will activate the natal position, you know, of that planet. Mm-hmm. So it's similar to that.
Okay. All right. So, and now then the whole thing about, okay, it's Ketu that's there, not Rahu. So in an eclipse, mm-hmm. which one is the most important, or are they just, it doesn't matter, they're both equally important, Rahu and Ketu?
It does matter. And
okay.
At least I draw a distinction between two types of eclipses, which is also astronomically, you know, delineated. There's south node eclipses and there's north node eclipses. So there's a Ketu eclipse and then there's a Rahu eclipse. Okay? It's one or the other, always. So they have different qualities altogether. It's a different process. And
okay, so basically the same qualities of Rahu and Ketu in natal astrology.
What I believe is that a Ketu eclipse is going to bring up more buried things for the person. And it's going to challenge them to release that. You know, it's a more purifying, psychologically purifying event where you're having to release like past patterns and things that you've repressed. You know, it all kind of comes out in a Ketu eclipse. These are also the eclipses that I notice people get fevers in most frequently, or sickness suddenly comes upon people because it's like suppressed pathology just starts to surface through Ketu's agency.
And that could be a good thing if you have.
It's absolutely a very good thing.
Yeah.
Very good thing.
And luckily, I do have a lot of tools for processing stuff when it comes up. And if you don't, then you go find somebody who does.
It's an opportunity, you know, because your natal Rahu and Ketu are what they are, and they're always active in the sense that, you know, they're part of your pattern, you could say, right?
Right.
So you can be tuning into, you know, working with your Rahu Ketu at any point in life, at any point in time, right? It doesn't depend on anything. But when we have these transits, like an eclipse, that's like a potent moment, you know, in which that's really coming to life and when you can really make some progress. So conversely, Rahu eclipses magnify something that's already there for us, you know? So it's always interesting to have a Rahu eclipse follow a Ketu eclipse because Ketu is going to drudge up everything that we've kind of vaulted away, that we have repressed, you know? But now that that's come to the surface, Rahu is going to be there to really magnify it and show us, like, look at this, you know, this is what you need to deal with. So Rahu gives us something that we actually need to like assimilate, you know. So Ketu is giving us something to let go of. Rahu is giving us something that we need to learn to digest better.
Okay.
You know, so two different functions, but they're similar.
That's really interesting because Rahu and Ketu are connected to the shadow, which is a concept in Jungian astrology, psychology, and it has to do with everything about ourselves that we don't like, everything about humanity that we don't like. Right. But it's also powers and talents and abilities that we've put aside too, because it didn't fit in with our environment or because letting them show would threaten a relationship, you know, because you're the writer, you're the painter, you're the reporter, you're the cop. You can't be both of those things in your mind.
Right.
So I imagine it must be pretty intense then for people who have Ketu in Capricorn in their natal chart.
I would say that, okay, this is the list of people who would be affected by this eclipse in Capricorn.
Right.
Capricorn Lagna, or a Lagna Lord, a person's Lagna Lord in Capricorn, because that would be another self factor. Sun, Moon, or Rahu Ketu, either one of those in Capricorn. So whether Ketu's crossing a natal Rahu or Ketu's, you know, a return crossing natal Ketu, either way, if it's crossing one of your natal nodal placements, that's going to be more intense. Like, imagine your situation, and if you actually had Ketu or Rahu in Capricorn, on top of being a Capricorn Lagna, that would be more intense than your Rahu hanging out in Scorpio in the midst of this.
Yeah. So, shall I
So
go ahead and share the screen then so that we can see the chart?
yeah, go ahead. Oh, I actually answer your other question, which was
Okay.
like, why are eclipses seen as negative events?
Go ahead.
Well,
Tell us a better way to think of this.
yeah, I don't agree with the notion that eclipses are a negative event. And there's some real reasons why eclipses have been regarded as inauspicious occurrences or negative omens or signs of disaster, misfortune, warfare, famine. You know, eclipses are associated with those things because in ancient times people observed that, you know, things got stirred up from these eclipses, and things that get stirred up means there's all kinds of stuff, but under the surface that's not so pretty that comes out, and it's like, wow, that's seen as a disaster. So there's some logic behind it, and I explore this a lot in my article because the Vedic perspective of eclipses is to view them as, you know, negative omens, basically, as inauspicious events that we need to protect ourselves from by staying indoors. You know, don't view the eclipse, don't go outside during the eclipse, perform these rituals during the eclipse so you can purify yourself of its kind of poisonous effect. And that's consistent with the imagery of Rahu and Ketu in Vedic mythology of as they're demons, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a kind of a demonic event in that sense. But there's another view of eclipses that I call a tantric view. And that views eclipses as an opportunity for spiritual practice. And eclipses in that view are not seen as a poison, but are seen as, you know, a nectar. It's like, this is a fuel. This is the fuel for a spiritual process. And this is the time when, you know, the traditional goals of yoga, you know, can be more readily realized. And there's esoteric reasons for that I couldn't possibly expound in this conversation, but that are in my article.
Okay, good.
But there's two views, you know. There's always this issue between nectar and poison, light and dark. Mm-hmm. And Tantra typically views things that are poisonous as being, you know, something that just needs to be digested properly.
Can I ask you something? Are you finished with your article?
I am.
Okay, great. So then let me tell everybody that I'm going to have a link to it down below the video. And when I post this on my website, I'll have it there too. So go ahead.
So there's that issue, right, between poison and nectar, and what from one view is regarded as poisonous and something to avoid is regarded from another point of view as something worth consuming, you know? So that's a paradox, and it just depends on understanding the philosophies behind those orientations. So I've tried to pick that apart for people so they can understand how to view eclipses. Like, how do we really understand eclipses in that light?
Okay, well, can you just give us some, like, talk about what archetypes are being activated here? You don't have to go into a lot of detail.
Okay.
And, you know, what about the fact that Saturn is with the sun? Does that make a difference? And Mercury being there and aspected by Jupiter. And I suppose you could count Mars too, because Mars has now gone into Aries and is making what is called a square or a 410 aspect to it. And do they have any effect on this?
Okay. Here's where I start in analyzing an eclipse. Is I will look at first I won't look at the eclipse itself. I'll look at the Saros series that the eclipse is a part of. Because this is the point.
Yeah, what is a Saros series?
This is an important point, which is eclipses themselves are part of a larger pattern. Okay, so an eclipse has its own pattern depending on where it's happening and all the other things happening at that time astrologically. But eclipses also occur in a cycle. And that cycle is described astronomically as Saros. And that's a Greek word that's now used to mathematically define the time between the recurrence of an eclipse. The Greeks calculated this a long time ago. Maybe the Indians did too. I don't know.
What does the word Saros mean?
You know, that's a good question. I think it literally means what I just said. But let me read you the definition real quick because it's really short and simple. Yeah, it's 18 years. Saros in astronomy, Saros, looks like it's pronounced Saros. A period of about 18 years between repetitions of solar and lunar eclipses. Okay.
Okay.
So every eclipse is part of a series. And so it belongs to a larger pattern. So the first thing to do when analyzing an eclipse is to chart the first eclipse of that series that it's occurring within. Because then you're going to see the context of the eclipse, the pattern of the eclipse at a larger level. So I always do that. I'll chart. This one is Saros Series 122. First eclipse in that series was in 991.
Okay, so
I look at that. I don't really look too much at the planets, what's happening in the planets. For this, I really prefer looking at the cards of truth.
Oh, really?
It consolidates everything. I will look at the birth card of the Saros series.
Okay, well, let's do that.
I'll look at, if it's a K2 eclipse, I'll check where K2 is in the spread. I'll check where, so this one, this eclipse is a 9 of spades.
Yeah.
And so the Saros series that it's happening in, the birth card for that is a 5 of diamonds.
Okay.
And this is really, this is really interesting because 9 is a number of K2.
Right.
Right? So it's interesting. We have a K2 eclipse that is a 9 of spades. And the other thing that's worth noticing is that most of the planets are in Mars and Saturn's cards.
Okay, so let me explain this to people watching. They may not be able to see these because they're really small. Okay, so the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Saturn, K2, and Pluto, and, well, okay, they're all on the Jack of Spades. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you mean? Or are you talking about here where Mars is? Oh. Mars, Venus, and Uranus is King of Diamonds. Mm-hmm. Is that what you're talking about?
That is what I'm talking about. I'm also talking about the Jack of Spades.
Okay, so these are the 9 of Spades, the Jack of Spades, and the King of Diamonds are in play, mostly.
Yeah, and I'm not even too worried about, the meaning of King of Diamonds and Jack of Spades in particular. I'm mostly interested in the meaning of the birth card of the eclipse, 9 of Spades. I'm interested in seeing what are the planetary, focal points. And the cards just show that really clearly, we're just looking at lordship, basically. Most of the planets are in Mars or Saturn signs. So that's important. So during this eclipse, there's a lot of Mars and Saturn energy going on, especially Saturn. And if you go back to the birth chart, I wanted to point something out. Is that there's a lot of Mars energy in this eclipse. Because Capricorn is the exaltation Rashi of Mars to begin with. Mars is in its own sign during the eclipse. It's also conjunct Uranus, which we can't see in your chart right now, but that is the case. The Lagna at the time of the eclipse is Libra, and the Lagna Lord is in Scorpio, which is a sign of Mars.
Let me fix that. Okay, so now we have all of them.
So, so Venus is in Mars sign also and is in opposition to Mars. And then everything else is in Capricorn.
Well, you mean it's in a Rossi aspect, a sign.
Yeah, exactly.
Aspect. Okay.
So that's really interesting. There's obviously, I think the question of this eclipse is how do we use our energies?
Right. And also Mars, K2 gives the results of Mars.
Exactly. That was the other point that I wanted to make. You're right.
And it's with your
results of Mars.
What are you thinking? Are you thinking like on a mundane nations level, or are you thinking more on a personal level?
I'm thinking on both levels.
Okay.
I think on the personal level, this whole Capricorn Cancer axis that's our eclipse axis, right? For the whole year and a little more, because that's where Rahu and Ketu are. So every eclipse is in this axis. What is this axis about? That Capricorn Cancer eclipse axis, or axis in general, is about action. Capricorn is about action, external action, that which we do, and Cancer is about a completely internal direction. you know? So there's a struggle between inner and outer, between the external things in life and the internal development of life. That's a big part of Cancer Capricorn. And with all this energy in Capricorn, which is a major, you know, very active Rashi, you know, Capricorn is about doing things.
Yeah, it's a movable sign.
Exactly. And it's, you know, the natural 10th sign and so on. So it's a major, major sign for action. So I think the question is, what do we need to understand about our actions? You know, how are we using our energies? How are we directing our energy in life? That needs to, there's a reevaluation about that. That's going to come through this eclipse. Maybe looking at what we're doing in terms of career or, you know, our relationships or anything, you know, that we're putting a lot of energy into, we're going to wonder, you know, it's like, what are the ways in which I've been limited? You know, what are the ways in which I'm not really acting in like the truly Capricorn sense, which is, why is Mars exalted in Capricorn? You know, because that's where Mars realizes its economy of action, you know, which is, it's noble.
Right.
It readily uses, you know, that which is good, and it discards that which is not good, that which is not usable, you know? So right action has that intelligence of being able to act for what is positive and assimilable and being able to release what is not useful.
Right. And also restraint, the ability to restrain yourself.
Discipline.
Because it's not the right time or the right thing.
Exactly. So what are the ways in which our action is not as true as it should be, or our action is, you know, has a shadow in it, that we're doing it for other reasons, we're doing it for selfish reasons, or we're not fully conscious of the ways in which we're investing ourselves in something? You know, that's a big question. Where are my energies going? How are they going in that direction? What is my intention? Because the whole Cancer Capricorn axis and Capricorn in general is really about karma yoga, as I see it. You know, it's about learning how to act in a way that you surrender the fruits of your actions. So I think that's the kind of thing that's going to come up through this eclipse. Personally, at the collective level, you can also see that that's going to be a process.
Yeah, and also if you look at it from the collective level or the mundane level, Rahu and Cancer having to do with foreign countries.
Right.
And then all this stuff here in Capricorn having to do with our own actions or inaction in relationship to foreign countries. Or foreign people. Doesn't necessarily have to be foreign countries. It can be the foreign people we have here in our country. So it would be interesting to see what does happen, if anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, you know, maybe again, like I said, I don't really follow politics very closely. So there's probably a whole lot of things I miss.
Yeah, and on that note, it's important to remember that with subtle things like this, shifts can happen at an energetic level that may not show evidence at a physical level for a long time.
Yeah, see, that's one of the problems I have with eclipses in terms of astrology, and that is there are plenty of other planets and planetary things going on that we could attribute things happening to. It's like, how can you distinguish between the planets, because they're the ones who cause everything to happen, and an eclipse? You know, it's just really so nebulous.
It is very nebulous, and you know, astrology is a conglomeration of so many influences. You know, not even just the Rashi, but then you have all the Vargas. It's like, how do you know? And then there's the dashas, then there's Rashi dashas, then there's all the nakshatras. Like, how do you really know what's triggering what? At the end of the day, it's pretty much impossible to like say scientifically, like, oh, you know, it's definitely this one thing that's doing it. It's all of it, you know? It's the whole thing. And I think, you know, eclipses should be studied, like very, very
research,
almost empirically. There needs to be research done where people who had like dramatic, you know, experiences during eclipses or not so dramatic, you really have to trace that, you know, and what's their report? And what are they saying several years later? Or what about these people who didn't experience something, but then they had a dramatic happening in their life 5 years later? Can we connect that to that eclipse moment? Is there a connection? We would have to really look at that.
So Capricorn is the crocodile in Vedic astrology.
Hmm.
So you want to talk a bit about that?
Well, yeah,
How,
I mean,
you know,
all the significations of Capricorn are valid because, I mean, what's unusual about this eclipse is all of the planets that are in Capricorn,
yeah.
right? That really stands out.
And the Lord of Capricorn is there too, Saturn.
Yeah, that's right.
And Saturn with the Sun, right? Because and they're enemies.
Yeah, it's only 4 degrees apart from the moon too, another enemy.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. Of course, my mind always goes to the president, simply because that's the sun,
Hmm.
the king, and Saturn there. I don't know. I see survival issues with this.
Yeah.
Just because Saturn, that's his main concern, is to help us to survive planet Earth and to prepare for a rainy day, so to speak, and be ready for these things and to endure, to persevere when things are hard.
It's also true that traditionally solar eclipses are seen as affecting government, government officials, all of those solar indications are given. So this is a solar eclipse, but the other thing to note about this eclipse is that it's a partial solar eclipse.
Right.
Like it's the total eclipses that are more intense. But it's still an eclipse, but partial. So within eclipses, there's like a range of intensity. Total is like, that's the most eclipsed you can get. It's complete.
Yeah. Do you have any diagrams of what this would look like astronomically?
I don't.
Okay, well, there are a lot of places online where you can see them.
If you Google images partial solar eclipse, you'll see what it looks like.
Right. Because the other day I was looking at them because there's another eclipse coming up later in the month. It's a total lunar eclipse, which we're not going to cover today. But my husband and I were looking it up. It's like, why isn't there an eclipse every month? And it has to do with the angle of the moon and the sun from each other as they go through the ecliptic. And there are lots of really good diagrams. I'll put it in my blog post because I saved them to put.
That's a good idea. It's worth showing people the astronomy of eclipses.
Yeah, so they can picture it. And probably that was part of the terror of an eclipse way back when, because they didn't have that kind of mental image in their mind to be able to see what was actually going on. It just looked like the sun was going away.
And the sun, in those times was seen as a symbol of the divine, of God. And, the sun and the moon in particular are the sources of life and nourishment for life on Earth.
Right.
Anytime they get shadowed, that's a cause for serious concern. It's like a death omen, basically.
Yeah.
And all of the Vedic rituals and sacrifices are oriented toward, maintaining that connection with the planetary deities, the gods,
So what kind of rituals are recommended?
From the Vedic perspective, there's several rituals that are recommended. One is that one should chant. One should engage in like the